are watching Simon Says on Mtgo Academy featuring Simon Götzen.
Hello and welcome everyone, Simon Götzen here recording Simon Says for mtgoacademy.com. And of course I have another journey into next draft for you, as you probably expected. This is the opening discussion that I like to record beforehand, and today's topic is going to be respect. Now, when Magic players talk about respect, Magic tournament players in particular, they usually mean sportsmanship or being nice and friendly and fair and whatnot when competing in tournaments. And all of that is definitely important in real life and also on Magic Online. Now, there is also another part of respect, and that's what I mean with the topic of today. And that is basically respecting what your opponent is doing, giving your opponent credit for the lines that they choose to play, for the cards that they play, for the attack and blocking decisions that they make, and so on. So in a sense, it's about giving your opponent credit even if there are reasons to believe that your opponent might be making a mistake. And I think that Theros in particular has highlighted this aspect of making sure you understand what's going on and not dismissing things as mistakes too hastily. And that's because of the abundance of tricks in the format, and also the several cards that in the format that allow you to raise very effectively, often winning in 1 or 2 attack steps when the game looked out of reach for your opponent. And I think this is not a simple thing, not a simple concept to talk about in the abstract. But let me ask you a question before I reveal what I've prepared for today. How many of you think that they are better than the average person that they play FNM with? Now, if you don't play FNM, but you only play Magic Online, how many of you think that they are better than the average player in the draft queues that you join? All right. A third question. How many of you think that they are better than the average viewer of this series of Simon Says? Now that's interesting, because I know for a fact that only half of you listening are going to be better than the other half on average. So if more than 50% of you answered with, I think I'm better than the average person watching Simon Says, then there's something wrong. And that's basically, there's a mistake being made when it comes to assessing your own playing abilities. And I'm not saying that you all suck. What I'm saying is that it's very, very easy to think that you're better than you are, or to think that other players are lesser players for whatever reasons. And just like playing Magic itself, there is always this variance involved, and there's always this hidden information that just makes it so difficult to really say what is a good play, what is the optimal play, and did I make the right decisions and lose anyway, or did I make the wrong decisions and lose because of it? And it's kind of the same in assessing how good of a player you are. Just because you win doesn't mean you're good. Just because you lose doesn't mean you're bad. But the truth is somewhere in the middle. And why is all of that important? Why am I talking about play skill in such an abstract way? Well, the thing is, whenever you're facing an opponent, in real life you actually see your opponent. On Magic Online, it's really just a username and the actions that your opponent has taken up until this point. That means that to correctly evaluate the moves of your opponent, you have to have an idea of how good your opponent is. And I know from experience, it's very, very easy to think that things that you don't understand or don't comprehend at first glance, to think of them as mistakes. You all know the feeling. Somebody attacks you and you think, well, that's a stupid attack. I'm just going to block like that. I get so much value by blocking like that. And then there's a trick that you didn't think of. Or 2 turns later, you realize that your opponent only wanted to deal that extra 1 point of damage because it was so important to his game plan. And there is very often you're getting punished for being too careless, but I don't know many scenarios where you get punished for being too careful, for giving your opponent too much credit. Because think about it that way. If your opponent is actually worse than you, actually making mistakes, and you might actually be witnessing one mistake, the amount of mistakes are going to add up and give you an edge, no matter what you do. So there's actually no reason to try to take full advantage, to exploit every single mistake to its fullest, because you want to have this little security window in case it's not a mistake, but your opponent is actually setting a trap for you. And this balance is something that's actually relevant in a lot of games, but people often overlook it. And I think it's a mixture of being very experienced, so we've all seen certain scenarios before, but also a little bit of hubris mix in. And that brings us back to Journey into Nyx. And what I've prepared today is actually a few snippets of a draft I played with pretty much mono black control. So what I'm planning to do here is to just show you some of these scenarios that end up being relevant here. And my deck is, I don't know, my deck is mediocre, I would say. I got powerful rares, but I also have to play a bunch of fillers and my mana isn't perfect. But I'm actually in a spot here against red-white aggro where I've handled almost everything that my opponent has done. I'm facing two power creatures. I have an 0/6, a 1/1 Death Touch, and a 3/4 Fate Unraveler just played. I also have a sip of Hemlock, but I'm only on 4 life. So that's when my opponent draws his card and attacks with both of his creatures. Now, the very first idea here is that, well, I have a 3/4 and an 0/6. I don't even need the Baleful Eidolon. I'm not taking any damage here, and I get to eat one of my opponent's creatures. Well, this is the first rule of respecting your opponent. If your opponent is attacking like that, there's 2 options. It's either a bluff, which we can basically rule out because I'm on 4 life. I have to call any bluff. And the second option is that there is a trick coming. And these tricks, there are many tricks that can happen here. And the trick that I'm thinking of in Theros is always +2/+2. Basically Battle-Wise Valor or some combination. It could also be Dauntless Onslaught or Coordinated Assault, but Coordinated Assault doesn't really make sense against Fate Unraveler. So +2 power is basically what I'm thinking here. Now take a second, pause this video if you want to just decide on your blocks, and then I'm going to show you how this played out. So what I did here is to just not block with Fate Unraveler, because it's so likely that Fate Unraveler is dying to a +2/+2 effect, and it's actually vital to my game plan and to my defense, that I would much rather have the Baleful Eidolon trade with a creature. The Gardens of Meletis, because of its 6 toughness, is relatively safe, and I'm blocking the Chrome Crusader with the wall, so that there isn't additional 1/1s being generated by combat tricks. And I think that's the much safer route, rather than blocking with Fate Unraveler and potentially losing it to a combat trick. Now, what actually happens here is that my opponent, we'll see that in a second, casts Rouse the Mob. So actually gets to target a Chrome Crusader and gets to make Traveling Philosopher a 4/2 with Trample. Now, I'm not saying that I made the perfect block, but I didn't make the obvious block because I respected that my opponent would have something. And it's actually not clear if trading Fate Unraveler for Traveling Philosopher would have been better, because then I still have the Baleful Eidolon and the Guardians, and I actually wouldn't take the trample damage. So the fact that I took trample damage here is quite good for my opponent, and was something that I didn't really consider because Rouse the Mob is not the card that I really chose to play around at that spot. So my opponent dealt some extra points of damage, and when I was about to stabilize, my opponent actually takes advantage of that 1 point of damage by Bolt of Kuranos-ing me out of the game. Alright, but there's other games to win, and that is actually against the same opponent. It's really good for me that my opponent already cast his Glimpse the Sun God, which you can see in his graveyard. However, I'm already down to 9. My opponent has a Labyrinth champion, and I have Keepsake Organ just played. So clearly my idea here is to get rid of the Labyrinth champion and to make sure that, well, my overwhelming board position just carries me to victory. And then something interesting happens. We'll see that in a second. My opponent Magma Jets me down to 7. Now, in general, pointing 2 points of burn damage at your opponent when they are still at 9 is not a good idea. However, this person doesn't have a target for Magma Jet, but probably didn't have a target for Magma Jet for a while, and is now opting to burn me down to 7, scry for another 2, and that has to... You can't just shrug that off and say, alright, Magma Jet me, that's fine. You have to think about what this implies. It implies that there is potentially more burn and more targeting effects coming for targeting the Labyrinth champion or burning me out, and I already saw the Bolt of Kuranos in game 1. So the fact that this Magma Jet is being played here, it sets off a huge alarm bell in my head, rather than me being happy about my opponent basically getting card disadvantage here, because at this position this game isn't about card advantage or disadvantage at all. It's only about me trying to protect my life total. And when my opponent drops two further 2/2s at this stage, and I draw, let's see, I draw a Drown in Sorrow, then I know for a fact that Labyrinth champion is much more dangerous than the random creatures my opponent has on his side of the board. There is still the threat of Rouse the Mob, but the fact that I know about that means that killing Labyrinth champion is my top priority. There's an additional advantage here, and that is that Nyxman Rolliker falls off once I kill the champion, and then Drown in Sorrow just sweeps everything up. So I think this is not a difficult decision per se, but it just shows that the simple fact that my opponent already started to Magma Jet me means that I have to be super careful with my life total from now on. And that's pretty much what I do. Killing Labyrinth champion with Keepsake Organ, and then next turn Drown in Sorrow basically wipes my opponent's board and gets me the victory. Here we go. This is the next situation that I wanted to talk about, and that's actually an interesting spot. I have Guardians of Meletis and Grim Guardian. My opponent has quite an aggressive draw, was able to generate an elemental token with a Nyxsmith, and has just cast Minotaur Skull Cleaver. Now I'm only holding a Necrobite, which means that I have a nice backup, but not much going on here. If my opponent actually attacks with everything, I'm already in a pretty bad spot, because even if I get to kill the Nyxsmith, I'm taking a ton of damage, and there isn't much I can do about it. With the Guardians preventing 4 damage, me taking 5, and then potential trick still being quite valuable for my opponent despite the Necrobite. And then something interesting happens. At least I think it's interesting. I wasn't expecting that. My opponent opts to only attack with Ereshkigal Sunguide and Minotaur Skull Cleaver, and of course I'm forced to block here. I want to protect my life total, and with the Necrobite that I actually want to be casting, this is an important aspect. I want to cast the Necrobite for mana purposes because I want to Spiteful Blow the next turn. And what happens here is Acolyte's Reward targeting Guardians of Meletis and Grim Guardian. Now, what does Acolyte's Reward say? Prevent the next X damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn. So my opponent is preventing the damage that would be dealt to Guardians of Meletis, and X is the devotion to white. So what this prevents is 1 damage to the Guardians and moves it over to the Grim Guardian. However, Grim Guardian has 4 toughness, so it's only going to take 2 from Ereshkigal Sunguide and 1 point of damage from the Acolyte's Reward, so effectively from the Skull Cleaver. I realized later what my opponent was trying here, or what my opponent thought would happen, and that is that he thought Acolyte's Reward counted your planes rather than your devotion to white. So this is a spot, and of course here my opponent is tapped out, so I don't have to expect anything else. But this is a spot where it's actually correct to identify this as a simple mistake that we can take advantage of by basically just letting the Acolyte's Reward resolve, and yeah, this basically netting us a card that doesn't help the opponent at all. So this I thought was quite a fun interaction. It's not always correct to think that your opponent is making optimal plays. I'm not saying that. It's just more important to have the right idea about things. All right, so I end up still casting the Necrobite anyway because I want the Resca Sun Guide gone, but the Acolyte's Reward has basically zero impact on what is happening here. And for the record, I still lose the game against Dictate of Heliod. Once my opponent has cast his 5-mana enchantment and a Quarry Colossus, I finally have to succumb to the beatdown, which is just a little bit too much, and the Drown in Sorrow for the rub-ins, basically. So let's stop right here. I know that my opponent has Dictate of Heliod, which he beat me with last game, and then I do have a Keepsake Organ and a Spiteful Blow, so I'm quite happy about this spot I'm in, with me being on 17 life. Now the problem is, my opponent has already reached 5 mana, and is only 1 mana away from monstrous-ing Ill-Tempered Cyclops. And then this happens. Now, it doesn't often happen that your opponent will attack into your Keepsake Organ like that. There is basically two things that I'm really thinking about here. And the first thing is Divine Verdict, which I probably can't beat, because if I just hold back, if I don't ever block with any of my creatures, then I'm just dying to the beatdown. Even with the Spiteful Blow, I think not blocking here is a bit too much. And why is not blocking so dangerous? Because the other card I'm thinking about is Dictate of Heliod. If I decline the block here, the 8 damage turn into 8 plus 6, 14 damage. I go down to 3, facing a 5/5 Trampler and 2 other lethal creatures. So just not blocking is not an option. However, I have to respect both the cards that I saw this game. And once you think about the fact that the worst case for you is clearly Dictate of Heliod, I think the block here is actually pretty simple. If it wasn't for Dictate of Heliod, you could, for example, block Resca Sun Guide with Servant of Timurid and either of the other creatures with Keepsake Organ, depending on what you want to play around. I would advise blocking Ill-Tempered Cyclops in that spot, but as you can see, a Dictate of Heliod would leave my opponent with the two pumped white creatures and me with nothing on the board, and then just playing catch up against the Dictate, which isn't likely to work out. So instead, I realized that I would only take 6 damage by blocking that way, and my opponent could play a Dictate, making that 10 damage. But if my opponent plays a Dictate and I get to keep the Keepsake Organ, then I will actually have board parity starting next turn, thanks to the Spiteful Blow and the Sip of Hemlock in my hand. So instead, what looked like a very threatening attack turned into me taking 6 and my opponent losing an Resca Sun Guide, with me having all these control options at hand. So that was just a pretty nice exchange for me, and my opponent actually does cast Dictate of Heliod later that game, so I assume that it was in his hand at that stage. All right, I have more. 4/4 Squelching Leeches. My opponent has a 2/4 Minotaur Skullcleaver with a Fearsome Temper, and it can't block, so my opponent is attacking with it. Now, if my opponent wanted to invest 3 mana, then my Squelching Leeches couldn't block. My opponent doesn't invest the 3 mana, so assuming that this is a mistake would be pretty crazy. I'm thinking about Dictate of Heliod once again, but the card I'm also thinking about is Divine Verdict. I think you see a pattern here. It's pretty much the same cards I talked about in the last game. But, of course, in this spot, I also lose my Squelching Leeches to any +2/+2 effect, which I definitely don't want, given that it's going to turn into a 5/5, and it's my only creature. So, instead I take 2 here, And what's going to happen is that my opponent doesn't cast anything else. So let's move this game forward. My opponent just passed the turn. I get a 5/5 Squelching Leeches, and I have all the time in the world. With the Lash of the Whip, what I could do would be to kill Minotaur Skullcleaver with Lash of the Whip, but I can't do that if my opponent might be holding Dictate of Heliod. So I just play this very patiently because I don't want my opponent to utilize his mana in case he has a Divine Verdict. And then we see another attack, and once again, no activation of a Fearsome Temper. Now, oftentimes, if you think your opponent is holding a pump spell, it's correct to block with the Squelching Leeches and then respond to the pump spell with Lash of the Whip. However, I'm putting my opponent on a Divine Verdict, and that means that I can't afford to block with Squelching Leeches. What I can, however, do is cast Lash of the Whip, and then something funny happens. If my opponent saves the Minotaur Skullcleaver with a +2/+2 effect or a Dictate, then he won't be able to Divine Verdict my Squelching Leeches, so then I still have the option to block. If my opponent lets his Minotaur Skullcleaver die here, then he's in a terrible spot. Assuming that he has Divine Verdict, we've basically traded pieces, virtually traded pieces, and my piece is a growing Squelching Leeches, my opponent's piece is a Divine Verdict, but I decide when my opponent gets to cast Divine Verdict, and because of that, I can just play the waiting game, which is all my deck wants to do. I respect the possibility of my opponent having Divine Verdict, and play around the worst case scenario, which is him having Divine Verdict, by just not allowing him to cast it. And this is where my opponent does lose patience a little bit, tapping basically out of Divine Verdict mana for an Oresca Sun Guide. And that is of course great for me because it allows me to develop my board further and to get in for damage, which is pretty much all I want. And then I will just be able to play around Divine Verdict again next turn. So what happens here is that I play the Keepsake Gorgon, my opponent passes the turn again, and I would have been ready to play around Divine Verdict again, but I drew a Necrobite, and the match takes its conclusion within the next seconds, which is pretty much what I expected to happen. My opponent casts the Divine Verdict, and I get to respond with the glorious Necrobite, and then that's pretty much it. My opponent not able to use the Divine Verdict in his favor, but rather giving me the option to outplay him a little bit with the cards and the options that I had. So that's it. Necrobite regenerating my Keepsake Gorgon. I was a bit confused about my opponent not targeting the Squelching Leeches, but at this stage my opponent was pretty much too far behind. Alright, the last example is this spot here, and I'm looking at an opponent in the finals that hasn't cast a single spell except for a Renowned Weaver, and you can see the Spider token in play. The 4 cards in the graveyard are actually milled by Returned Centaur, and I have put on a little bit of an aggro start because I already lost game 1 and I knew that I needed some help against what my opponent was doing. So where in this spot do you give your opponent credit? There isn't an actual mistake that I can spot. Well, think about it for a second. In which regard do we have to give our opponent credit here? We have to give our opponent credit for keeping that hand. Now, of course, I didn't tell you if there were mulligans involved or not, but let's just assume that my opponent kept a reasonable hand. Now, is turn 1 Renowned Weaver, make a Spider, and then say go for 3 turns a reasonable hand? I wouldn't say so. I mean, what kind of hand can you keep that only does that? It's basically lands and Renowned Weaver, and that's it, because any reasonable deck in this format has stuff to do under 5 mana or under 6 mana. So there's pretty much one explanation here, and that is that there is a Flash Flyer coming. Now, a 3/2 flyer wouldn't be a big problem because all my creatures are 2 power. However, it's very reasonable to assume that my opponent would have cast it last turn where he had all the mana in the world. So what's it going to be instead? It's going to be Fleetfeather Cockatrice. And I pretty much know that it's Fleetfeather Cockatrice. But look at my hand, look at my board. I can give my opponent credit for having Fleetfeather Cockatrice here, for keeping a hand that does at least something up until turn 5. But I'm not really winning the game if I now respect the fact that there is a Fleetfeather Cockatrice waiting for me. Because if I don't deal damage this turn, I'm not dealing damage the next turn either. And I'm still dying to Fleetfeather Cockatrice. So I have to take my chances here. And I'm attacking anyway. It's not a good feeling, because if you give your opponent even the slightest amount of credit, you know what's going to happen. But still, at least you knew what your fate was going to be. And that pretty much ends this little segment. This was a very long opening discussion. I thought it would be fun to show you some actual gameplay footage and to discuss some of these things in detail, with the key point being that respecting what your opponent does and trying to understand what your opponent does will be so much better for you and for your growth as a Magic player, compared to just thinking that you are better than whoever you're sitting across from, and that whatever you don't understand must be a mistake because of that. Hubris is bad, respect is good. Thank you for watching, enjoy the draft, and see you next time.